Okay, and welcome back to another episode of the Striped Bass Hunt Podcast. I am extremely excited for this episode. I know I say that every single episode, but I am actually extremely excited for this episode, and because it's probably one of the most important ones that we are going to be doing this. Well, I wouldn't say like that we're going to be doing period, but like I'm just going to say that it's pretty important. And the reason that it's so important is it's the beginning of the striped bass coming into my area. First fish of the season. So I do have to apologize. I did not do a podcast last week, and that was strictly because I didn't really have much to talk about last week. I did a podcast. I didn't really like what I was saying in it, as in like there's not much that I was really saying that was really new, and I wanted to bring something new to you guys. So today I'm able to talk about my experience catching my first striped bass of spring for 2021. So my first spring bass of 2021, which is pretty extraordinary. How I think I was probably one of the first people, at least I got some fresh fish really early on into the migration being in my area. So, we'll talk about that. And what I mean by my area is I mean by like around like south of me, like an hour 45 south of me. And that's pretty much as, I guess, as, specific as I want to get about it, but regardless, I got it pretty close to where I'm at. So I'm always, as I always say, and I've said a lot of times before, I'm such a wimp when it comes to driving. I just don't like to drive further than like 30 minutes to catch striped bass. It's just like, I don't know. I just feel like I live in such a great area for it. I have no real need to drive over 30 minutes to catch a fish. And so when it comes to driving, an hour, hour and a half, hour 45 to 2 hours, I'm always like, oh, I really don't want to do that. But the spring is definitely one of those times where it is, I guess it's one of those times where, I got a little desperate to catch some fish, as everybody else is. And I was really feeling the cabin fever last week. And I was like, well, I know that there's fish in this area. I have a very strong feeling about it. I know people have been catching holdover fish there. And I heard whispers and reports of maybe there being fresh fish a little bit further south than that. But, a possibility of catching maybe holdovers / fresh fish. So when I look for like a nice spring area to first go into and check out and fish, I always look for like rivers where there's going to be herring, where there's going to be just where there's going to be an influx of bait fish and something that I can really pattern down and maybe kind of be like them feeding on a little bit larger bait fish, because it makes it a lot easier for me to catch a bass when it's not feeding on something super small. When it's a little bit bigger of a prey item, they tend to be a little bit more aggressive towards it. So I always like to fish rivers, especially where there might be some herring. I know it was a little early for herring, I guess, in this area. Maybe not, though. I guess it's the beginning of the herring run, I would say. But catching bass that were the size that I caught and the amount that I caught was actually really shocking to me. I thought maybe I would be able to go back into the estuaries and pull out maybe a few schoolies, but that actually was, well, I guess it was totally not the case, but it was pretty much I would say the best case scenario for me. Where I was able to get onto a bunch of really nice sized schoolie bass. So I really wanted to break down what I was looking for, and if you're going to go on a trip a little south, or if you're trying to go and find early spring bass no matter where you are, what I like to look for, even though this is not technically my area and not an area that I fish and structure that I fish a lot of, it's something very similar to what we have on Cape Ann, and I've done very well in this area. So I was fishing an outflow when I caught those fish. Now the thing about outflows is it's like a fast food place for striped bass. So what I mean by that is when they're on their migration, it's like a pit stop. They come in, they feed for a little tide or two, and then they keep moving. And this goes for bass from 20 inches or less, from 5 inches really, all the way to 55 inches. Like you can catch huge fish in outflows during the spring run, and it's one of the best places to actually look for early spring bass, especially larger fish. So I went to an outflow that I saw, and the reason I like this one was I know there's a strong holdover population in this river. So that was number one that I really like. And the reason I like that is because I know that there's probably a good amount of bait fish in that river. So what happens is when a lot of bait fish gets dumped out of there, herring, little like holdover peanuts, other small white bait, the bass get really frothed up on that, and that's what they like to feed on. So what I was looking for there was a river where I could fish, where there was estuary connected to that, and where it would kind of dump out. So it was not actually my first spot. So I have to admit, like it was my backup plan. So what happened was I went there initially trying to target, holdovers to maybe some fresh fish if they're in the area. I didn't personally believe that there were fresh fish in the area until I ended up catching them. But I thought that there was a decent chance. Like if I had to give a percentage, I was probably, well, I guess you can't really give a percentage, but regardless, it was like one of those things where there was a strong chance of there being fish, and then there's not a very strong chance of them being fresh, but there was still like some action in that area. But turns out they were fresh fish, but we'll get to that in a second. So what I did was I started by going back into the estuary. And for me personally on Cape Ann, I did last year a decent amount of fishing in the estuary. I did a lot of guiding in the estuary. So I was very productive in getting onto numbers of schoolie-sized bass. And what I mean schoolie-sized bass, I'm talking about bass from really small, like 5-inch fish, as you've probably seen on Instagram, me holding up tiny bass. But I even got bass up to 35 inches in the estuaries. So that was also really fun too. And I tend to throw like 2 or 3 different lures in the estuaries, and I really am productive with them. One of them being a algag whippet fish, another one being like a 6-inch sluggo with an owner beast hook, which is what turned out to be the money lure for this trip. And the other one being a Rebel jumping minnow. It's really kind of a staple in my bag. And there's a few others obviously in there that I did well on, like small glide baits and stuff that I really did well on in the estuaries this year. But those were like the main stuff that I was fishing with. So when it comes to what I was initially thinking is I was going to go find a place pretty far up in the estuary where I initially believed that there probably was going to be some bass of some sort, whether they were holdovers or not. And I turned out I got there. I had to say it was probably the last 2 hours of the outgoing. And the reason I chose that as when I wanted to start fishing was because obviously when you're trying to find a new area and you're trying to fish a new area, structure is something that you can't really see that well on Google Earth. And Google Earth will definitely help you, but only to a certain extent. So I tried to fish the last 2 hours of the outgoing. And keep in mind, I've never fished this spot before, ever. So this was literally the first time I've ever fished here. And it was the last 2 hours of the outgoing, and I went to the spot that I believed would probably hold some fish. I fished a few creek mouths. I fished off the sod banks. It was more of a sandy estuary from what I normally fish, but yeah, there's some muddy areas to it. So it was pretty similar to the same structure that I would fish on Cape Ann for striped bass in estuaries, or in an estuary scenario. So I was fishing this area where there's, some outflows, some rips, some, holes, and I was just fishing it like I would on Cape Ann. And one of the most productive lures for that is the algag whippet fish. I have a lot of confidence in that plug catching I feel very confident that they would hit that if it was in the area. And I did end up catching some fish that trip on the algag whippet fish, but I ended up catching my bigger bass and was definitely getting my bigger hits on the sluggos. So I first started in that area. I worked a whole section of it, and the tide was just starting to slack off. And so I was like, you know what? During the slack tide, I know that what happens is as the water fills all the way up throughout the day, the water's gonna warm up, and then as it drains out, it's also gonna get warmer and warmer with the mud flats warming up as well. So I knew that the water that was getting dumped out of the estuary was probably gonna be pretty warm water. The other thing I was dealing with too was there's a lot of seaweed back in the back in the estuary, and it was like the I don't even know exactly what people would call it, but it was very there's a name for it, but I forget exactly what it is. Anyway, but it was seaweed, and it was one of those seaweeds that just gets all over everything and kind of clogs up your guides a little bit. It was nasty stuff. And so anyway, I knew that, probably wasn't happening there. So I ended up moving at the end of the tide just to the mouth of the outflow. I fished up to the mouth of the outflow. I did notice with my eyes some deeper water, which I saw on Google Earth and which I was expecting there to be fish in. So I ended up going, as I was working my way out, I probably started, I don't know, maybe 50 yards from the mouth of the outflow and started working my way up into the deeper water that was right around the mouth of the outflow. And then finally, when I got to the mouth of the outflow, so we're talking about, this is just where the water's dumping out into the ocean. It was probably pretty warm water because it was all that water that was warming up throughout the day in the estuary. So what happened was all that warmer water is getting dumped out into the really like clean ocean water. It was all clean. There's no seaweed or anything in it. The current was almost non-existent, but yeah, there's a little outgoing current there. And it was interesting because later I ended up fishing that same spot and the current was absolutely ripping. I was fishing on the same tide. It was that night where everything was like, it was snowing. It was so cold. A front came through. It was really windy and the bite was completely shut off. But that earlier that day, it was a little bit calmer. I was able to get over to the area. The tide was definitely much the current was not as strong as it was. So I could use generally, what I would like to say is during those times where the current is not super strong in an estuary, you can actually work a sluggo pretty effectively. When it gets too strong, sometimes it gets swept out and you can't really work a sluggo like you want to. But it was slow enough that I could work a sluggo how I wanted. And immediately, as soon as I cast it into the darker water, in the gin clear water, but it was like the deeper section of the water, immediately there's bass hitting it. And I ended up catching one really, really small bass to start off my season. It was probably 12 inches. And then my next fish was actually one of the biggest fish I got, which was like 23, maybe 24 inches, which for me, especially being the first fish of the season or one of the first fresh fish of the season, is super awesome. And the reason I know that they're fresh fish is because generally when you see holdover fish, they're pretty beaten up. They're pretty sluggish. And these fish were so clean. They didn't have a blemish on them. They're just really healthy, fat fish. And you could just tell that they were not roughing it through the winter in the estuary. I did not personally see any sea lice on them, but there's just absolutely no way that those were not fresh fish. Like I'm very, very sure that those were not holdovers. There's 100% that they were fresh fish. I might have flipped that, but whatever. They were fresh fish. I can almost guarantee that. And then it turns out later that week there's a bunch of fresh fish in that area. So like I know that that was just the beginning, the first wave, maybe the first tide that there was actually fresh fish in that area. So I ended up catching, oh my gosh, probably somewhere around 12 to maybe 13 fish, and I don't know, it was probably an hour and a half. So I was catching them pretty much every cast. I even threw on an algag whippet fish. I caught a few fish on that. I threw on a little topwater because they were just being so aggressive. I thought, maybe I could get them on a little jumping minnow. They did not hit the jumping minnow, but what can you do? This is really early season bass, and I only casted twice, so who knows? I just was too stoked to be on them. I was like, you know what? I can't be cocky right now and pull out a topwater. I'm gonna stick with the sluggo, cheat a little bit, and then catch some fish. So I do have right behind me here I almost hit the camera over. I do have right behind me here the exact sluggo that I was fishing with and the leader material. So I just want to go over the rod. I've gone over this a lot for the spring, but you guys should know it by now. Anyway, so I have a really beaten up. I have a really beaten up sluggo here. You probably can't really see it on the camera, but there's definitely some fish marks on this. Actually, I can take it off the TA clip. But the I don't know if you'll be able to see this on the camera, but it's not, I guess, really beaten up, but it's been chewed on a little bit. Anyway, so I have a 6-inch sluggo, and what is the ounce or the owner beast hook is 1/8 ounce. I believe this is the 1/8 ounce Owner Beast size 4.0 hook on a 6-inch sluggo in pearl or white or whatever you want to call it. This was really doing a number on the larger fish. And it's just one of those things that sluggos just really produce, especially when the fish are being not as aggressive. Now, these fish, to me, were feeding pretty aggressively, but I guess you could say they weren't feeding that aggressively to the point that they weren't hitting topwater plugs. And they're only exclusively hitting soft plastics, because I did throw on a bucktail, because I was like, you know what, if I can get them on a bucktail, that's kind of my best case scenario. But also, I do have to point out, sluggos with Owner Beast hooks are really nice on the striped bass. Obviously, it's a singular hook, but it's also a very thin hook itself. So when it goes into the fish, it's not really going to mess up the bass too much, especially before it does its trip more further north. Anyway, but so it's a pretty nice plug to use on the just like for schoolie size bass, I guess, in general. But yeah, so what I was saying is I get to that spot, and the way I work it is I like to twitch it and kind of pause, and generally they'll hit it on the pause. So what you do is you twitch pretty violently, and what happens is that thing's going to kind of dart around a little bit, and then it's going to glide in the current, and it's going to have a very natural sitting position when it glides because of that belly weight on it, and it glides. And then when it glides, you try your best to keep and maintain tension to it, but don't worry about when the bass grabs onto it, because in my opinion, what you want to have happen, let me just take this off of here again, sorry. So generally what will happen is maybe the bass will come in and grab the tail of it, if it's a really small schoolies like they were this time, and then you give it a second to kind of grab it again. So what I like to personally do is when it grabs, when I feel that first tick, I kind of pause for just not even a half a second, but like very, very, I'm not like immediately going to strike and whack it like I'm fishing a bucktail or something like that. I'm going to almost let it pause for like a half a second, and then I hook set into the fish. And yeah, there's a few times where I pulled it out of fish's mouths, but it was probably mostly because they're tiny bass. But there are some better ones mixed in, and the ones that were better I was definitely connecting with. And the great thing about these hooks is they're just so good with, number one, they're weedless, and number two, they hold fish well, just the way that it all works out. So sluggos are a really awesome thing to throw in the spring. They're very, they have very lifelike action to them. And yeah, I mean, they're pretty durable. I caught, as I said, like 12, well, not on this in particular, I probably caught 8 fish on this sluggo, and it's still held up pretty well. And I will continue to fish this exact sluggo the next time I go out for spring schoolies, which I will get to in a second, because I'm pretty confident is going to be this week for Cape Ann. And I'm recording this on Sunday, and this will probably come out on Sunday, if not maybe Monday. But I'm pretty confident that we will be seeing our first schoolies of the season like pretty soon. But anyway, so back to the story. So I really did try to fish a few different plugs just to see how they were reacting to different things. I was kind of curious to see if they were, because if they started hitting topwater, I could definitively said that they weren't holdovers. But the fact that they were so close to the ocean, like literally you have your freshwater area and then 10 feet further out there to been in the ocean, to me would signify that they're probably fresh fish. But I guess there's always that chance, but I really highly doubt that they were. They were fighting very aggressively, and they were just not there. There's like all their fins were fully intact. All their colors were dark, like they might've been in like a boulder field almost. So like I would have been a little bit shocked if they weren't, cause if they're in that estuary, I would assume that they'd have very light sandy color to them. But I would have been shocked if somebody could have definitively told me that those were holdovers. I would have been pretty surprised. But I think that was pretty good for being like some of the first fish of the season for me. Getting on a bite like that where I could get a handful of really nice quality schoolies, as I would like to say. I probably caught, out of the like 12 or so that I caught, 13 to, I don't even know. It was definitely over 10. It was a few over 10. But I kind of stopped counting once I got to 10. But out of those, I probably got 4 that were in the 20-inch size, and then, one where it was like 24 inches. So it was definitely nothing that sizable, but it was very fun to get onto some action like that. And I really hope that they come in quickly. But what makes me think that is what I've always heard is by the time that they hit Cape Cod, and like the general rule of thumb that I always live by is by the time they hit Cape Cod, we generally have about a week and a half before we start seeing them on Cape Ann, which is really awesome. So and the way that the moon hits and falls this year, I really, really do feel confident we will see some schoolies this week, maybe mid to end of this week. I've been saying, oh, it's going to be the 25th, 26th. It's the 25th today. It's definitely not today. I'd be very surprised if there's schoolies today. But as we get closer and closer to the end of this week, I'd be less and less surprised if people start pulling some schoolies off of Cape Ann, especially just because after this moon goes through, the bass kind of just materialize out of nowhere. It just seems to happen like that around the moon phases. So even when it's like the schoolies are in and then all of a sudden you have like a full or a new moon go through and then it's like they're really in, like they're everywhere once the moon goes through. And I think that that's going to happen this year. I just have a good feeling, just the way that the weather's going and how early I got on those bass where I was fishing. I was like, okay, I'm feeling pretty confident that we're going to get into some schoolies pretty quick, faster than I think a lot of people actually believe. But yeah, I would say sometime mid this week, I'm going to start really going hard. And I'll probably be fishing once a day until I start really getting onto some fish. And then I'm going to be going 3 times a day and we'll really crack it wide open. But yeah, so I do have some ideas of what to do. And again, kind of the areas that I really like to look for are estuaries that are off of harbors, or little back bay areas that are off of harbors. We have a few really good ones, in my opinion, around Cape Ann and a little south of Cape Ann that are pretty big. But I feel like those are probably the first areas that start to hold some fish, because I know there's a lot of bait fish in there. And I've been driving by the harbor, every day, and I've been seeing very consistently that there's been a lot of cormorants in the inner harbor, and they're feeding on very small bait fish of some sort. As that's all I've been able to see with my eyes from how far away I was. So I'm praying to God that it's not rain bait, because my vendetta against rain bait being just such a difficult thing for me to be able to replicate. Like, there's literally nothing, in my opinion, that is harder to replicate than replicating what a rain bait looks like. And also when they're in massive schools, like I'm talking about, you have acres of just the water being thick with rain bait, and then you have like 5 or 6 bass that are just plowing through them. It's nearly impossible to catch them when they're doing that. So you really got to focus on where those herring are to be able to pull fish when that's the case. If that's not the case and there's no rain bait this year, I do definitely say, like, I'm going to be poking around the harbors and the estuaries around those harbors. And then if that's not really working out, then I'm going to go to where the herring runs are. And then I'm going to really push around where the herring runs are. I will tell you guys, probably, I wouldn't be shocked if I see a bass with my own eyes. If there's rain bait around, you generally will see bass pushing bait around, or at least some bait fish, or some like fish will be pushing bait around. Last year, I believe it was the 26th or 27th that I saw bass, I believe, really small bass feeding on rain bait. They could have been pollock, but I highly doubt it. I just don't think pollock would have gone. I just have not really seen pollock this time of year. I know they're around like crazy. I mean, this past fall, I was fly fishing for them out of the harbor with a 5-weight and catching like, 10, 12-inch pollock on the 5-weight fly rod, which was so much fun because they're feeding on little peanut bunker. And it was so funny because I was fishing for them, and I was fishing for them with the fly rod, and I would hook into them, and then I'd be fighting them. And it was so funny. The bass I would see, like, and this was late in the fall. I'm talking about like November, like in November. It was probably like the first week of November, and I was hooked into them, and I was like pulling them in, and I would see like a 30 or 33-inch striped bass following the pollock up, like wanting to eat the pollock. Or if I hooked a mackerel, it was the same deal. They would come up kind of chasing the mackerel around, because it was like mackerel and pollock blitzing on peanut bunker, which was kind of really cool to see. And I really hope that it is peanut bunker too. Like the other possibilities, there's two things that could be, in my opinion. It's either rain bait or peanut bunker. Those are like the only two things that I could imagine it being. It could be really small herring, but I think it's too I think it's a little too, well, I think it's way too early for the herring to be fully out spawned and then their babies to hatch and whatever. But yeah, so I really do think it's probably either rain bait or if it's going to maybe peanut bunker. If it's peanut bunker, we're set. Like this is going to be a crazy, crazy spring if there's a ton of peanut bunker that moved in for some reason. But we'll see what happens. But yeah, so I also, I guess with the rod and reel setup, I say it a lot, but I guess I'll go over it quickly. I was running the 9 foot light carbon surf, which is the 3/8 to 2 ounces. It's a 9 foot rod. I have it paired with a 150 Van Staal 30-pound braid to 30-pound Blue Label Seagar. I have a 80-pound Spro power swivel to a 75. Is it a 75 pound or 50 pound? 50 pound tactical angler's clip. So that's what I was running for the for my early spring, kind of beating up on the schoolie action type rod reel. That's like it's like the most fun rod and reel to ever fish with. And the other reel that I do use on that rod is the Penn Slammer 3. And it's the smallest Penn Slammer 3. I don't even know what the model number. Maybe it's like the 1500 or I don't know. It's something like that. But it's a smaller reel. Same deal, 30-pound braid on that. And then the other thing I kind of wanted to talk about, which I was fishing with somebody that was fishing with the small Saltex reel. I don't even know what the smallest Saltex reel is, but those things are absolute garbage. I highly suggest not getting them because I have broken more of those fishing in a shorter amount of time than I've ever seen, and other people fishing with those as well. I mean, I believe the gears, the drag gears in the inside, because what happens is it broke and they handed me the reel to see what happened. And I was like, I think your bearings or gears on the inside of the reel have somehow gotten dislodged. But yeah, it's the worst. So I definitely suggest not getting that. I know a lot of people are super excited about that, including me. I was like, wow, if we can find a reel that's going to be as well, or not as well sealed, but it's going to be pretty well sealed, about the same as a Van Staal, but have a smoother drag, maybe a heavier drag, and as well as having pretty decent, having a pretty smooth reeling as well. I was pretty excited about it personally, and it just turned out as a dud. And that's really me being brutally honest and a little bit angry at the reel. But I heard good things about it, but I feel like I don't know. I've just had the worst luck. I've seen three of those reels break really quickly. It's a shame. And Pens, even my Penn Slammers, like going strong, and I pretty much fish them the same. So it's pretty extraordinary to me that, a reel that's supposed to be so well sealed and so, hardy, or like has that label of being like a strong reel, kind of put in that same category in everybody's minds as like a Van Staal, is so brutally disappointing to me, I guess. But I don't want to be too against it, but I do have to say I think it's a really good concept for a reel. I mean, it has really smooth drag, like a really strong, like it puts out a lot of drag. I don't know exactly what it is, as the amount of drag that it puts out, but it's also a pretty smooth reel in general. And so I was impressed by the concept of it is great, I think, but I think they put it out too soon. If that would be my guess, I think they needed to kind of fine tune some of the kinks in that reel a little bit before they put it out, because it's just not, at least the ones that I've seen have just not been able to hold up. And I'm talking about 2-3 trips and they're broken. Like that's how quick they're breaking. And I swear to you that like I'm not dunking these reels, I'm not dropping these reels, like nothing like that. I'm literally fishing and I'm catching a lot of fish and they're just getting destroyed. It's really unfortunate. Even though it's like the fish I'm catching, especially when I was fishing with those, I think the biggest fish that reel's caught is probably 38, maybe 40 inches. And that was during a blitz, but most of the fish it's been catching are like mid to high 20-inch bass. And I mean, it's crazy. The gears just kept getting, I think they just strip. I think I don't really know what like the innards of a reel, but I think that it's just that it's too loose. That main gear in it's just a little too loose, and it keeps like getting stripped or like grinding. It's not good. Whatever it is, it doesn't feel good to reel, and it's kind of unfortunate. So then later that day, I kind of want to get back to what happened during that trip. So I went for an overnight. I was going to fish, the late morning, early afternoon, and then I was going to fish afternoon, higher tide, and then I was going to fish that night and then the next morning. And I didn't end up fishing the next morning. It was just so freaking cold and blowing like 40 miles an hour. It was like, I don't know, it was like what? It was probably like a 30-degree wind chill. It was so bad. It was just like the worst. And so anyway, so I get out there in for the evening session, and it is blowing like crazy. I mean, in the current, like it's blowing the same direction as the current. So it's like an outgoing, same tide, just like later that day. And it is absolutely ripping. Like I'm talking about, I had to fish 2-ounce bucktails in it, and it was swinging it really quick. The water was dirty. There was seaweed. It was almost immediately a nightmare. And I threw black and purple SP minnow, swung that. I threw a small glide bait and was swinging that. And just nothing was really, I mean, it was just too seaweed. I mean, I was getting clean. Like it was one of those deals where I was getting clean casts through. Like I was getting the whole cast that was clean. Every other cast was clean. Every other one was dirty. And I think the water was probably a little bit dirty. The wind, I mean, it dropped, I don't know, probably 10, 15 degrees. The wind chill was brutal. It was blowing probably 40. Yeah, so I didn't last very long. Probably fished 45 minutes to an hour and was like didn't even get a touch from when it was like literally consistent action. If I wasn't getting a fish every cast, I was getting a hit every cast. So I knew that nothing was going to go down. I was hoping maybe I would last a little longer, but then I was like, screw it. It's not worth it. The next day I woke up, it was just as cold and windier. And I was like, you know what? There's no way there's going to be fish. And so I didn't even fish. But the really good thing that I think we're going to take away from this is, number one, I found a new pretty cool spot to fish. I have a new, new appreciation for like outflowy fishing, just like river mouths in general. I knew they're productive. I fished them countless times. I've caught fish out of them, but most of the time that I'll fish them is a little later in the season. I generally like staying a little bit further back in the estuary. And it turned out that day I was fishing, or at least like in general, I've been fishing in the early spring, I'm always like in my mind, okay, we'll get deep into the estuaries where there's mud flats that warm up. And then once the tide comes up a little bit, there's going to be bass back in there, and they'll be feeding on, the bait fish in there in the warmer water. But it didn't end up like that. So that was for a plan B in early spring. It was actually pretty productive. And I think I'm going to bank that in my little memory bank of, okay, if we're going to have an end of the outgoing during the early spring, maybe, and you're not getting consistent action in the estuary, maybe go to the mouth, really try to see if you can find some schoolies at the mouth of the estuary that are just poking around, feeding on those all the bait fish that's just at the mouth getting washed out. So I think that that's something that I really wanted to share, because I think it's something that could be pretty productive for other people as well, especially this early in the spring. I know for most of us that are not like, I don't know, Connecticut to New York, New Jersey, that area, but for most of us that are like, I guess, Maine, New Hampshire, Mass, and I guess Rhode Island, I would say, is about, I know Rhode Island, you're not catching really that many big fish on Rhode Island right now, but we're just going to say, yeah, from Rhode Island to Maine, pretty much, we have to kind of deal with a lot of schoolies through till I'd say you probably start seeing bigger bass mid-May. I know you can see some pretty sizable bass mid-May, through Cape Cod and probably Rhode Island and Massachusetts. We're going to be seeing them trickle in, and I'm sure June, like through early June, you're definitely kind of getting better and better throughout Mass, and definitely better and better throughout Maine and New Hampshire and whatever. But I think the fishing is going to be increasingly getting better on Cape Cod, because I'm just inundated with information from everybody saying, oh, I caught my first schoolie of the season, which is super awesome to hear. I love hearing reports like this. It really kind of gives me a really up-to-date and good piece together awareness of where the fish are at. And I've been hearing lots and lots. I'd probably today, well, between the last 2 days, I've probably gotten 35 to 40 DMs of just people saying, oh, I got my first spring bass of the season, which is super awesome to hear. Most of those were like Rhode Island and Cape Cod. So we know that there's bass from Rhode Island to Cape Cod now pretty strong. And that's really, really awesome to hear. I know that Cape Cod's pretty inundated with schoolies right now. I would say if you really want to go catch some schoolies, poke around in the estuaries, poke around in the salt ponds. I would not be shocked if you can land or start ending up getting into some better and better bites. I think that they're going to start showing up in all your regular areas pretty soon. I think probably mid this week, if you're on Cape Cod, they're going to be on the beaches. They're probably going to be all over the schoolies. I think that by mid this week, we'll start hearing reports of them being in south or a little further south from Cape Ann. I'm talking about 10-minute drive from Cape Ann south, maybe 30-minute drive from Cape Ann south. So like we're talking maybe Salem area, we'll start seeing them, and probably to Gloucester this week, I would assume. I would be a betting man, which I am at the moment. I'm hoping that they're going to be in because I really want to start fishing and really start fishing hard. So yeah, I mean, as far as what I'm feeling and what I'm hearing, I definitely think that the bass are pushing really fast right now. I think that the moon tides are going to do something very specific and very interesting, which is it's going to affect the herring runs. But what I mean by that is I think that there's going to be a good amount of action in those rivers and estuaries that have herring this week. I would highly suggest fishing at night, and I would highly suggest fishing with like long, skinny, soft plastics that kind of mimic some sort of herring. Maybe if you think about them not fishing, if you can find like a dam where they get pushed up, you can maybe fish that pretty well. If you think about like how herring act, they like to be kind of up on the surface and they kind of jump out of the water and they zip around the surface of the water. So something like something very similar to the way I fish a sluggo, where I twitch, pause. I think that's going to be your key. And I think big twitches, I'm talking about sweep that rod, really work a soft plastic where it's twitching around really quick and then kind of glides. I think that that's going to be the key to getting some bass this year or this spring, and maybe even some larger fish early this spring. Maybe there's some larger holdovers around. You might be able to crack a 30-incher or a 33-incher. It would be pretty sick on those herring runs. And then obviously as the herring runs progress and the season progresses, I'm sure that we'll start to see, the odd 35 to 40-inch bass being mixed in with those herring runs. But that's everything. It's, I guess, things to come and things to think about. But yeah, I guess something that I got recently and I want to try is everybody keeps telling me I need to try the Albie snacks in the spring. So I got some white and purple ones, and I rigged them on a Owner Beast hook like I would a sluggo, and I think I'm going to kind of fish them the same way. I got ones that are like black and purple, and I got ones that are like a white pearl color. I think that those are going to be kind of interesting to fish, just because I think you can work them a lot like a spook under the surface of the water. From what I'm hearing, it's pretty similar to a sluggo. I don't know why I keep losing my train of thought with the word sluggo, but yeah, so pretty similar to a sluggo, and in the way that you can kind of twitch it around and kind of work it like a spook a little bit under the water, like a subsurface-esque thing. I like the size of it too. It's kind of the same size as like a jumping minnow is, and I think it's going to be very productive for these early spring bass, especially if they're on really small bait, and that is my worry. They are on small bait. And so if they are, I think I'm going to change up my strategy from last year. I do have some very small, thin sluggos that I can always, fish that way if I need to. I got some metals. I got some tins that I guess you could say that I could really kind of use those as a way to mimic the bait. I also have some smaller red fins that I'm kind of excited about. I think that those will mimic the smaller bait as well. Obviously, small SP minnows are pretty good. The only worry I have, though, is that a lot of the bait, what happened last year was it was just in such skinny water, and it was also there were just so many. It was just like hundreds and thousands of these rain bait, and they would just cover such a large section that you could, dip down in your hand in the water, just grab a handful of them. Like there's that many that you could, in the middle of the waters, dip your hand into them and grab a handful. And they're trying to get away. There's just so many of them. They're just getting pushed up onto the surface. So like fiercely, it was insane. The seagulls were going nuts. So I really hope that that's not the case this year. And as I said, if that is the case, I am going to definitely have to go and really try my best to focus on fishing in those rivers that have the herring. And I think it will be interesting though. This year fishing, I want to do it differently this spring. I want to learn some new estuaries that I know are really productive, and I have a better feeling about it this spring. Oh man. Yeah, I'm really excited. I'm glad I got my first few schoolies under my belt this year already. It's really actually quite awesome that I did. I'm pretty stoked at the moment that I was able to get on them. And I really hope that you guys start to see some action where you're at this week. I'm sure that a lot of you guys that listen to me are around Massachusetts, which means that you're probably going to start seeing some schoolies showing up pretty shortly if you're on Mass. And I'm really stoked because obviously I'm pretty north of like Boston. So I'm sure they're going to be really soon. If not now, I would start really poking around if you're like Boston area. I really wouldn't be shocked if you had some schoolies this tonight being the 25th or whatever it is. And definitely the 26th, like that area is going to be full of fish, I think, really shortly. And then those bass will be here in 3 or 4 days. I mean, that's how quick it's going to be, because all they do, and from what my knowledge of it is that a lot of them, they kind of just go a little bit offshore, and then they just come onshore at these tides, and they follow the bait in. And especially if you have a strong onshore wind or something that really pushes them. So say we got like a big nor'easter or something, it would blow a lot of the fish from Cape Cod to us pretty quick. It just seems to be how it works a lot of the time. And I think that's kind of what we had happen last year, where it was like nothing. They're a little late. They weren't late, but when they showed up after one of the bigger storms early on in the year, it was like, boom, they're there. They're like all over the place. And yeah, they were like blitzing on the rain bait. It was crazy to see just out of nowhere, all these fish just appear. Anyway, so thank you guys for watching and listening to this podcast, and I will see you next time.